Welcome to Michigan's Adventure in Muskegon, Michigan. This park has grown a lot over the years. It's now part of the Cedar Fair chain, and it's a really beautiful park with a lot to offer, including one of the best wooden roller coasters in the world. There you can see the Mad Mouse, and that's a really interesting Mad Mouse. It's one of the few made by Aero Development, and it has some really interesting trick track in it. That's a lot of fun. But here's the entrance. There's a security checkpoint and the ticket gates, and let's pass through those and move on to the main midway. So this is where you come out at the Snoopy Boutique, which is, of course, a huge Peanuts-themed gift shop. Because it's Cedar Fair, they have Peanuts licensing all over, and they have a Snoopy area, which you'll see a little later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sort of clockwise trip around the park. It's a little difficult to do because the park has one of the strangest layouts I've ever seen. It's built around a very large lake, and the park is essentially a big C shape, like a letter C, and you can't easily get from one area to another. You can now take a train. In the past, they never had a train that would take you, so you'd get to one end of the sea and you'd simply have to double back around the pond. Now when you get to that end, you can actually hop on the train and it'll get you to the other end of that sea. So there is a better way to get around. So here you see there are some kiddie rides back here. This used to be a more extensive kiddie land, and it's been revised a bit. That is Zach Zoomer, which is a really fun coaster. It was built in 1994 by Custom Coasters, and it was named after the owner's grandson. Now here is a Camp Snoopy area. Now usually you either have a Camp Snoopy or a Planet Snoopy, and this is a really nicely themed one. It's very similar to one that's at Cedar Point, and I'm not going to go through it because I've been through plenty of Camp Snoopies, but it just has a bunch of kiddie rides that are all themed to Peanuts characters. In front of us is one of the first big coasters that the park put in, the Corkscrew, and this is one of the first Aero Development corkscrews ever made. Over here you can see this is unusual. This is a sort of play area, an outdoor play area in the Camp Snoopy area with slides and climbing equipment. Usually don't see that in the Camp Snoopies. The park opened basically in 1956, but it was called Deer Park, and it was mostly a petting zoo back then. And it gradually grew, and they started adding a few kiddie rides. In 1968, Roger Jordan purchased the park and continued to expand it and add more carnival rides. But the big transition happened in 1988. Roger's daughter took over the park and named it Michigan's Adventure, and that's when they really started to make some big changes. And one of the first big changes they made was the coaster that you see in front of you there in the distance, Wolverine Wildcat, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Over here is Rocky Point Golf. Now if you take this path and you follow it to the right, you'll be on the other end of the sea midway. You can walk around that way, but we're going to continue along this way around the pond. There is a very large water park called Wild Water Adventures, and you'll see the entrance to that in a minute. There's a big buffet area over there, and this has, in this area, one of the prettiest scenic views of any amusement park I've ever been to. The big red coaster over there is a typical Vekoma hang and bang, they call them. It's a suspended looping coaster that's pretty violent. And that was obtained from Geauga Lake in Ohio when Geauga Lake closed. But here you can see some of the water park come into view over on the left. And notice all the concrete around here. The owners owned a concrete business, and so instead of getting asphalt for the midway, they just used their business to make the entire thing concrete, which makes it a lot cooler on a hot summer day. So there's the turnaround of Wolverine Wildcat. That coaster was built by Charlie Dinn, designed by Curtis Summers, and the idea was to try to imitate Knobel's famous Phoenix roller coaster. And I'm not sure they quite succeeded with that, but it's actually one of the better Curtis Summers rides that I've ridden. Has quite a bit of airtime in it. And it's interesting, the first drop has been completely replaced with Titan tracks. So it's essentially a steel coaster on the first drop. And when I rode it on this visit, I was amazed at how smooth it was. It was like riding a steel coaster. And then you get into the wooden track and it gets a lot bumpier like a normal wood coaster. It's a little interesting contrast there. But that coaster does have an interesting double up and double down element in it. That's a lot of fun. And in the distance there, below the Sky Coaster, you can see a collection of swan boats. They have paddle boats out on the lake, and the swan boats came from Cedar Point, and they look beautiful out there. It's a really good fit for the park. And coming up on the left here is the entrance to Wildwater Adventures. And notice a lot of beautiful plantings in the park. There are a lot of trees, but they're not down the main midway. The midway is so wide that it can get a little hot walking around. And like I said, the concrete helps, and thankfully there is some shade here and there. There's another view of the Wolverine Wildcat, but you can see another lift hill far in the distance, and we'll get to that in a little bit. If you want a little orientation, we began at the far southern end of the park and headed directly north, and now we're at the far northern end of the park and we're heading east. There's another view of the expansive lake. Building the Wolverine Wildcat in 1988 was a really bold move for the park. It was risky because the place was fairly remote, but it paid dividends because it got the attention of amusement park and coaster enthusiasts and brought them to the park. And the continual addition of more and more roller coasters has really helped the attendance. So Zach Zoomer was another wooden coaster, giving them 2. And then in 1997, that was the year of Shivering Timbers, which was the other lift hill that was out there. So, and we're going to get to that in a minute. Coming up on the right is the entrance to Thunderhawk, the suspended coaster, the big red one. On the left was the entrance to Adventure Falls, which is the park's drenching Shoot the Chutes ride. And then the last major ride in this area is, at the very end here, a wonderfully named river rapids ride called Grand Rapids. And it has some of the nicest theming I've ever seen on a rapids ride. So we'll take a little closer look at this here as we get up to it. I have yet to ride any of those Vekoma suspended looping coasters where my head didn't get bashed around in the restraints. So that's a glimpse of Grand Rapids. And now over here is the north station of the Timbertown Railway. And remember I said, unless you want to walk all the way back around, this is the only way to get to the southern end of the park from here. And I'm glad they have it. It's a very nice ride. So we'll dissolve on through and get off at the station at the southern end. And I have a link in the description to a separate video of a ride on that if you want to take a ride on the train to see what it's like. So this places us at the back end of Wolverine Wildcat, and that is the entrance over there to the coaster. And there are a couple ways you can go from here. If I were to take that alleyway over on the left, it would drop me off essentially by the Rocky Point Golf Course. But we're going to make a bigger circuit around to do the full clockwise rotation around the park. And way at the end there, you can see that tan building. That's the bumper car building, and we'll see that a little later, just to give you perspective. That was the entrance to Loggers Run, which is a really nice aero flume ride, and you can see those stilts in there. Most of the ride is set way up in the air, the typical aero log flume from that period. So you get really nice views around the park. And it's interesting that the whole landscaping around there is basically just mowed grass. I like that little train concession on the left here, which normally has sunglasses. They had a lot of heavy rain in this area, so a lot of the stuff was pulled in. And then over here is the entrance to the reason to come to this park. Shivering Timbers, one of the greatest wooden roller coasters ever built. It was installed by Custom Coasters in 1997. It's only 125 feet high. It feels a lot higher, and it feels a lot faster than it goes. When you get back to the station, the wheels underneath the train are still spinning wildly because it has so much energy to burn off. The coaster is one of my dream coasters. It is all just one massive camelback hill after another all the way out and all the way back, sort of like a gigantic version of the old Mountain Flyer from Mountain Park. It's just an airtime monster, one airtime hill after another, and it's nonstop. At the very end, there's a helix, which interestingly was added later in the design phase because the designers realized the train had too much speed coming into the station and they had to burn off the speed somehow. So what they did is they added that big helix at the end to try to slow the train down a bit. But it's an amazing ride. Highly, highly recommended. Every coaster enthusiast needs to do that coaster. And when the coaster was first built, it was a really, really impressive sight when you pulled into the parking lot because it spanned the entire parking lot. It was just this huge, massive coaster all the way the length of the parking lot. And the entrance to the park was right near the entrance of Shivering Timbers. But that's changed. They shifted the entrance of the park further down, and they've also allowed a lot of trees to grow up in front of the structure. So it's almost impossible to really see that panoramic view of the ride anymore. But it still is just amazing. I love that coaster. And in front of us is that tan and red building I pointed out a little while ago, the bumper car building. And I like all these fountains they have around the ponds and the little creeks that they have. And over here on the left is something that's a rare sight, and it actually harkens back to the origins of this park. It's a little petting zoo. So they have goats and I think some alpacas and rabbits, and it's called Funland Farm, and the kids really like that. And there's the Mad Mouse over on the left. You can see the Ferris wheel here, but that's not the entrance. That was the exit to the Ferris wheel. And this is bringing us back toward the entrance of the park where we started off. Yeah, this Mad Mouse at the very end, before you come back to the station, it has one of the first instances I can ever remember of a track banking outwards. So as you go around the corner, the track banks to the outside, and then it rotates and banks back in, and it gives you this really off-centered feeling as you come around. It's a fun effect. And this is the entrance to the Ferris wheel, and I guess they expected a lot of people to ride this. That is a massive entrance. And the corner store has a lot of souvenirs, including some really nice Shivering Timbers t-shirts. And of course magnets and cups and everything you can imagine. Here are some more kiddie rides. You can see Wolverine Wildcat off in the distance there. Now if you were to follow this path in front of you, it would take you up the side by Loggers Run, where we were a little while ago. And that brings us back toward the entrance. And that retro-looking blue building in front of us is the Coaster's Drive-In Diner. And it has the typical hamburgers and milkshake food that you'd expect from a 1950s themed restaurant. And there's the corkscrew, and if we follow that, that would take us north up toward the lake view and the water park again. And that's where we came in and we started the video, was down that alley. And this is another way to get back to the entrance. So if you are anywhere near the Michigan area, it's really worth it to come out to this park. It's a beautiful park, and Shivering Timbers is a phenomenal ride. So make a stop at Michigan's Adventure in Muskegon, Michigan.